Hi, I'm Linda Hixon of the Hopedale Women's History Project. I wanted to talk to you about the Hopedale Sewing Circle, which is actually a really big thing to discuss because it lasts for off and on for almost 150 years. So we can't talk about the whole of it, but we can talk about parts of it. This presentation was supposed to happen in 2020, in part because we published our first book on the Hopedale Sewing Circle called Following the Threads, the Hopedale Sewing Circle 1874 to 1924. And that actually is the second part of the sewing circle because the first part, even though it's only one record, is really dense with a lot of information. So we're still working on that first part. But unfortunately, that presentation didn't happen, obviously. And as grateful as I am to Hopedale Cable to be able to do this for me, I do miss the in-person presentations, and I can't wait to get back to an audience and the question and answer periods, because that's my favorite part. But the Hopedale Sewing Circle, the original record, which we're still working on, is in this little marble notebook that's in Bancroft Memorial Library, named after one of the Sewing Circle members, Sylvia Bancroft. The book itself was probably made by the community because they actually did create blank books. It's one of the industries they had in town. And the first day, February of 1848, they created a sewing circle. It's called the Hopedale Sewing Circle and Tract Society. Female members are required to meet at the regular meetings of the society and work for the cause. And the cause they're talking about is not abolition. It's out there that they were an abolitionist sewing circle, and eventually they sort of become an abolitionist sewing circle, but that's not why they started, and that's not what they were. That minimizes their cause totally. The tracts in the Hopedale Sewing Circle and Tract Society that they're talking about are tracts about practical Christianity and about one of their important beliefs, which was what they called non-resistance, which is the opposition to war and to violence of any kind. They didn't consider themselves to be pacifists. Aiden Ballou said they weren't passive on anything. They were active in everything. But they were against war and violence. It's just what they were. And in that first record, it's not a women's sewing circle. There's 19 men and 19 women approximately that sign up. So about 40 people, half of which are men, sign up for this. And the men were they didn't have to work for the cause. They were supposed to pay 50 cents a year in order to be part of the sewing circle. And what they end up doing is working for Hopedale, for the community. Aiden Ballou actually praised them later in his history of the Hopedale community, saying that there was a lot of stuff that would not have been able to happen in Hopedale, particularly caring for people, if it hadn't been for the women of the sewing circle. And in December of 1849, they work for Mrs. Provan and her family. And they talk about sewing for her family and her children in the record. And they talk about it around Christmas, but she died. Mrs. Provan, Jeanette Provan, died on December 9th. And Aiden Ballou actually wrote about her in his History of Milford, which was written in 1880. He said that Mrs. Jeanette had come across the Atlantic already in consumption and died here. She had tuberculosis. And she came from Scotland with her husband Thomas and their children to settle specifically in Hopedale, which is awesome. And she ends up dying in Hopedale. And the women sew for her children and for her husband. And eventually Thomas married Rebecca Davis, who was a member of the sewing circle. And after Rebecca died, he married her sister, Jane Davis Stimson, who was also a member of the sewing circle and was a widow. So he ended up marrying sisters, also not uncommon at the time. It wasn't just Hopedale. The women sew for lots of things. They sew not only for the community and for abolition, they sew for orphans, they sew for lots of different causes. Mostly they sew for the community. They sew bedding for the water cure establishment and for the Hopedale school. which had students that lived there. They sew clothing for the workers in town, mostly for men. They bind carpets. They sew comfortables, which are like quilts, only not quilted. And they do quilt, but very rarely. They do straw braiding, which was a big thing because men wore straw hats in the summer at this point in time. And there were several straw braiding establishments in Milford. My family actually owned one, the Carol Hixon and Jones straw braiding hat manufactory or whatever it was, ended up where Regal Shrews was later on. And something changes in 1850 around the time that we start to hear rumblings of women's rights. There's a convention in Worcester in the fall of 1850 on women's rights where one of the Sewing Circle members, Abby Hills Price, speaks. And the Sewing Circle shifts to become a woman's only thing. 46 women sign up in 1850, and only women. Men will come in and out of the record. They will come to talk to the ladies. They will bring their instruments, and then there will be like music. But men aren't members anymore. In 1850, it shifts. And Abby Hills Price spoke at this 1850 convention. She was very important in Hopedale. She was the first president of the Sewing Circle, although she resigned at the following meeting because she was just too darn busy. Abby Hills Price was an abolitionist speaker. She was on the move all the time, and she just didn't have time to do it. Lucy Ballou, the wife of Aidan Ballou, was what they would eventually start calling the directress. And in 1851, one of the entries talks about quite a full attendance and very pleasant, both out and indoors, social and merry. They talk about stuff like that a lot, like this being a social group, a group where they can have fun and talk to each other. And in November, after the convention happens in Worcester, Mrs. Humphrey, Elmira Humphrey, proposed that some question be brought before each meeting for discussion. The members generally approved of the proposition. At least 16 members of the community, and probably closer to 20 and maybe even more, attended that convention, including 6 women from the Hopedale Sewing Circle, and there were actually more women from Hopedale that attended. And it's an awesome place for the women to discuss the topics of the day. Elmira Humphrey attended. I love this picture of her. She's got her little ringlets, and she's got on a shawl and a pretty dress and a little smile on her face and some glasses. I think that she would be fun to know. Anne Fish, Catherine Munyon, Rebecca Provan, who married Thomas, attended. She had married him in 1850 also. Elizabeth Dodge, Mary Davis, Mary Ann Walden, Joanna Ballou, Abby Price, of course, who served on one of the committees, and Anna Draper, who was the wife of Ebenezer Draper, who started what would become the Draper Companies in Hopedale. He started it, we think, at the Little Red Shop Museum. They broke ground for that building in the summer of 1842. Not 1841, like it says on the building. That was a Draper rewrite of history. They didn't actually start using the building until 1843. So, yeah, that's a historical rewrite. Anna and Ebenezer moved to the community in April of 1842, so it's impossible for them to have started any time before that. When they meet at Abby Hills Price's house, Anna Draper reads, quote, a very interesting piece on women's rights. Since 1848, the Practical Christian had run, just in those first couple of years of the Sewing Circle, they'd had run at least 14 articles on women's rights during that period. And in April 1851, we have a really interesting thing that most past historians who have looked at the record have honed in on. Some conversation with regard to having a female physician located here. It was universally thought advisable. Well, that female physician was Emily Gay. And she had been an Aidan Ballou follower since like 1839, even before Hopedale existed. She had been out of town. She'd gone to Blackstone to learn her trade as a homeopathic physician, and had come back to Hopedale. And so they're talking about Emily, who ends up being part of the sewing circle. And she did. She basically spent the entirety of her life working in Hopedale and Milford, helping to heal people. But we had a second female physician who was also a sewing circle member, Phyla Wilmarth, who actually went to a women's medical college. So she was trained as a doctor. They had just started medical colleges at this time. And unfortunately, she was only a physician for a few years before she herself became ill. She was dead before 1860, so it's kind of a sad story. But for a time in the 1850s, Hopedale had 2 women doctors, which is way more than many towns had, since most women doctors didn't even exist at this point in time. They also met at Sylvia Bancroft's house, which is not the house we see in Hopedale now. The Bancroft House still exists in Hopedale. It's right next to Bancroft Memorial Library, which was named after Sylvia. But this was their first house. I believe it's in the same lot, but they rebuilt it, made it much bigger. She was the first to sign her name to the record. Most of the early entries, we know probably who wrote them because it would have been the secretary. But occasionally the secretary wasn't there, so somebody else would write the entries. Sylvia Bancroft started signing her name to the entries. And after she did that, S.W.T. Bancroft, other women started doing it too. So we know who wrote the entries. We know their style of writing. We know who could spell and who couldn't. And spelling wasn't, it hadn't been standardized at this point in time. So not being able to spell was not a big deal. It's not like you went to school to learn how to spell. They hadn't standardized it. It was mostly phonetic, but some of them were worse than others. She had a tragedy in her life where, and it's not noted in the Sewing Circle record, in March of 1851, she gave birth to triplets. Really unusual at this time. The girl, Minerva, dies that day that the triplets are born. She was born with 2 brothers, Walter and William, and they last for several days after that, slowly dying over the course of about 11 days. And the community knew that last little baby boy was not going to survive because they wait and bury all 3 at the same time. And Aidan Ballou, his record is skewed. It's off kilter. It takes up a bunch of lines, which he rarely does in his funeral record. And he doesn't even remember the exact date they buried them. So you know that the community was thrown into turmoil during the life and death of these 3 little children. But they don't mention it in the record. Hannah Draper, we know that her family comes to town by 1854. And we know that because they show up. She shows up in the Sewing Circle record. Perhaps some of us exercised unduly our mirthfulness. If so, we trust in future to show, especially those who feel responsible for the propriety and good order of our meetings, that, quote, a word to the wise is sufficient. Hannah and Sylvia were sisters. Sylvia was a twin. In this photograph, the top row, Sylvia is the one leaning in towards the woman in the center. That's Minerva Knight. Minerva, her daughter who died, was named after her aunt. And the woman on the other end of the top row is Hannah Draper. Hannah was the one who was married to George Draper. So they're in town by 1854. Right below Hannah in this photo is Anna Draper. That would have been Ebenezer's wife. So we had 3 sisters, and actually there were several other Thwing sisters who show up in the Sewing Circle record too. So it's probably more like 5 or 6 of them show up in the record. The original record is short, but it's full of interest. It's only about 80 or 90 pages over the 15 years it lasts. April of 1854, Sarah Holbrook goes to Worcester to divorce her husband. Again, doesn't show up in the record, but the women talk about a woman's right to her children, because at this point in time, if you divorced your husband for abandonment or for abuse or for adultery, the 3 A's, which pretty much the only way you could divorced your husband and abuse didn't even count back then, you would lose the right to your children because you lived under what were considered coverture laws, meaning that the man controlled everything in your life. You couldn't sign a contract, you couldn't earn money or keep money. You weren't allowed to inherit his property. You only got dower rights, which was a third of his property for the rest of your life. The laws are getting more liberal at this point in time. The man she divorced, William Rich, was a drunk, and he had abused her, and he'd abandoned her. So she was able to take back her premarital property and her name. She became Sarah Holbrook again and lived the rest of her life in Hopedale, and the second incarnation of the Sewing Circle will take care of her. The other thing that happens in the Sewing Circle record that's fabulous is the sewing machine. It shows up in 1859. They're meeting at Anna Draper's. Actually, they're meeting at Sylvia Bancroft's. Anna Draper is the president at this point. And Mrs. Harlow being present with her sewing machine, it required several industrious fitters to supply work for her rapidly moving needle. And her efficient assistance greatly increased the usual amount of labor performed by the society. That must have been so cool. This image, which is from the Library of Congress, shows an occupational portrait of a woman working at a sewing machine. I hate to correct you, Library of Congress. She's not working. She's sitting with her sewing machine, showing you how important it is in her life. This is a tintype in a frame. I've never seen a tintype like this, with a woman with her occupational tool sitting right there with her. The sewing machine that Mrs. Harlow brought to the Sewing Circle may have been a small machine with a hand crank. They were available. At this point in time, they didn't have the big treadle machines yet. Those will come later. And this picture is of a native seamstress holding her small sewing machine from Puerto Rico, although they've spelled it Porto at that point in time, Puerto Rico. The Sewing Circle also sews for the contrabands during the Civil War in the 1861 and 1862, right before the record ends, which it ends in December of 1862. They sew for the contrabands are the slaves escaping to the Union soldiers' lines. And they sew for these people to try and help them. They send them clothing, bag of clothing. They send them cloth so they can make their own clothing, and they raise $95, which they end up sending to them right at the end of 1862. And that's about $2,500 in today's money, so a decent amount of money. The Sewing Circle record ends in 1862, just done, even though there's many pages left in the book. In 1881, it picks up again, and the records of the new circle are in Hopedale Unitarian Church. But we know from Hannah Osgood, the daughter of Hannah Draper, that the Sewing Circle actually regrouped in 1874, and they're sewing for the Boston Children's Mission, which is orphan children, again, following that pattern of the early Sewing Circle. She convinced the women to start keeping the record again in 1881, and she later writes a book for the 50th anniversary of the Sewing Circle, 1874 to 1924. She doesn't really note that there was an original Sewing Circle. She sort of hints at it, but doesn't really note it. And this Sewing Circle contained not only the original members. Sylvia Bancroft is in it. Hannah Draper is in it. Sarah Holbrook is in it. Anna, unfortunately, had died in 1870 of breast cancer, so she's not in it. But it also contains their daughters, who are now in their late teens, early 20s. Hannah is the president of the new record several times. Her photo is not in, this is Hannah Draper, George Draper's wife. Her photo is not in a photo album they have of the Sewing Circle presidents. I don't know why. She also loaned money to the group on several occasions. Not gave, but loaned, which is kind of cool. Sylvia Bancroft's daughters are in the record, Lilla and Lura, and Anna. Anna Minerva Bancroft, who was born in 1853, the first child after the triplets died. She was instrumental in getting that group to become part of the Unitarian Women's Alliance, which is a national group of Unitarian women that meet and work for Unitarian causes, and they do that around 1900. And like I said, Hannah Osgood and Anna Bancroft are cousins. So they are in this record together, working on different things. And in the record, again, they're working for the community. It's not just about raising money for orphans in Boston or for Unitarian causes, and they do actually make donations to other parishes in other states and other areas. When they're having fairs, we'll send them this many bags, or we'll give them a donation because we don't have enough time to make bags. But they're also raising money for the community. They raise money for people in town. And remember, before 1886, town is also Milford, because Hopedale is part of Milford. They raise money for people in town that don't have enough. They raised money for someone called Mrs. Brown. They want to get Mrs. Brown what she needs so her kids can attend Sunday school, because they're not coming properly dressed. So they give her 12 yards of unbleached cloth, probably muslin, and they give her 40 diapers. She obviously has a baby. They give her 2 flannel skirts, a blanket, and 2, quote, print dresses. And then they pay $2.25 for the Brown children. We don't know exactly what for, but they pay that for the Brown children. It may have been to buy something as simple as food. I'm not sure. But this is what they do. They help out in the community. Even though Hopedale is becoming this very wealthy, very powerful town during this period, they're helping people who need help. Could be that Mrs. Brown was a widow. They don't give us enough information, and it's a very common name. We don't know her first name, so it's really hard to look her up. But this is what they do. Now, it's not all positive. Shocking to me, and I shouldn't have been shocked, in 1885, they note their first minstrel show. The women of the sewing circle, every couple of months, would have a day where they'd spend the whole day in the church. And in 1885, this would have been Aidan Ballew's church, not Hopedale Unitarian Church, which was built later. They had an entertainment after their meal, because they were there all day and they had a meal, and then they would have someone entertain or speak after the meal. And in 1885, they have a minstrel show. It's not the only one that shows up in the record. It shows up only occasionally, but it does show up. And it was a little heartbreaking, because this is only 23 years after these women sewed for the contrabands. And now these women and their daughters are watching a minstrel show. It was not uncommon in Hopedale. It was not uncommon in Massachusetts. It was not uncommon anywhere in the country at that period of time. But it's important to make note of it, and it's important to know that it happened and potentially why it happened. There weren't any Black people living in Hopedale at that point in time. Like I said, they were initially meeting in Aidan Ballew's church. If you look at this photo, it's an aerial shot, and I use that term loosely because it's probably somebody standing on top of one of Draper's smokestacks taking a picture, glass negative. But Aidan Ballew's church is the dark building in the center of the picture, approximately where Hopedale Unitarian Church is right now, Memorial Church is right now. In that church, they hold fairs, where they sew and cook for the fairs. They earn money that way. They spend a lot of it on the church itself. They had a church parlor there. They bought a new carpet for the church, and they sold the old carpet in order to help pay for the new one. They redecorate. They sew covers for cushions. They do all of that for Aidan Ballew's church. And then in 1898, Eben Sumner Draper, who would become governor of Massachusetts, and George Albert Draper, both of whom were George and Hannah Draper's sons, and Hannah Osgood's brothers, build Memorial Church in honor of their parents in the 1890s, and Aidan Ballew's church comes down, even though it's only about 35 years old at that point. But then they start meeting in the ladies' parlor in the Hopedale Unitarian Church. So They worked for both churches. One thing I noticed with the new church, once the Memorial Church opens, is they spent a lot of their money on flowers for church services, and on the music program. So they supported both of those things, plus they're still helping out in the community. They send cards to people who are ill. They send flowers to people who are ill. And they send a lot of flowers to funerals as the important people in Hopedale start to get old and die. The original community members were, like I said, non-resistance. They didn't believe in war. But the sewing circle starts sewing for the troops, starting with the Spanish-American War in 1898. And they sew for the Red Cross during World War I. They met in the summer in 1917, which they never did, and 1918. They had stopped meeting in the summer in the 1880s because all the rich people were out of town for the summer. They'd go down to the Cape or wherever. So they didn't meet in the summer. They stopped after May or June. So they met in the summer. They sewed, they knitted socks, hats, they rolled and made bandages, and they have a list of what they did during World War I that literally amounts to thousands of pieces that they donated to the cause. They had almost 70 volunteers at one point, and so Eben S. Draper offers, quote, the use of the lower part of his house to the Red Cross workers of Hopedale. The room is to be kept in order by his caretakers. He wasn't living there at the time. Heated and lighted at his expense, and shall be open every morning, afternoon, and evening, as long as this war shall last. So they do a lot of things for the community and for the troops. They will do that in World War II also. They support the original Sewing Circle members, including Sarah Holbrook and Nancy Lewis, and Elizabeth Adams. She was an early Aiden Ballou follower, moved to Hopedale with the original community, lived the rest of her life in Hopedale with her husband Abner. She lived another 20 plus years after he died. She lives to be 100. Highly unusual at this point in time. And the Sewing Circle keeps throwing her birthday parties and acknowledging her birthday as she gets into her 90s, because she's the eldest member to ever exist in this group. And she's still there and she's still living. And in 1911, they throw her 100th birthday party. The Milford Daily Journal comes. They report on it. They took this photo. School kids had come to her house and sang for her. She got a carriage ride around town. Susan Whitney, who became a Hopedale historian, sort of, amateur historian, she read a historical sketch. We don't have a copy of it, unfortunately. And Marion Welch read about Elizabeth's life, noted that Elizabeth now had a telephone, so she could call her loved ones. She'd outlived most of her children, but she still had 3 surviving children, and she was able to call them on the phone now. Mrs. Adams has seen this little village become a flourishing manufacturing town that ranks second to none in the state for its beauty, Marion said. Not one person who was living in the town of Milford at the time she was born is now alive. What a depressing thing to say to a 100-year-old. After the Sewing Circle becomes the Alliance, they start keeping important Hopedale history. The Jones house had been torn down by the Draper Company in the 1880s, but in 1902, Mrs. Bracken, who was one of Sylvia Bancroft's daughters, gave a paper on the Jones house. And Mrs. Dutcher gave another paper that same night on the interior of the house. And they actually saved that stone, the door stone from the old house that had existed outside the old house, and put it in Ballou Park, which is really cool. And Hannah Osgood, Hannah Draper's daughter, was instrumental in helping a ladies' parlor be built in the community house in the 1920s so that women could meet in that house. I'm Linda Hixon. Thank you for joining me for this very, very minute look at a huge Sewing Circle record. It's an ongoing project. There's so many books. And thanks to the Hopedale Cultural Council and the Massachusetts Cultural Council for supporting this event. Thank you also to Bancroft Memorial Library and the Little Red Shop for sharing some of their images. And a lot of the images you've seen have also come from the Library of Congress. An awesome website. I recommend it. For more information, you can go to hopedalewomen.org. I'm Linda Hixon. Thank you again. Good night.